Thanks for joining us tonight. And I entitled this talk, Learning to Fly in a Global Pandemic. I chose this title because I believe it captures what our job is with our adolescents right now, which is not necessarily an easy task, but not an impossible task either. They need us to help to facilitate their broader developmental projects as they navigate the pandemic. So my goal today is to apply what we know promotes resilience in our adolescents to the situation of the pandemic. I have also been asked to spend some time today talking about how to respond to self-injury in our adolescents. And this may be a jarring juxtaposition because on the one hand, I'm talking about how to guide our kids through with the firm belief that our kids can indeed get through with our support. And I'm also going to be talking about some frightening symptoms. But that might be a mix of what we are all feeling right now. We're alternating hope and fear, which we try to steer back towards hope. I think we can all kind of relate to that experience at this point in the pandemic. I know that when I started preparing this presentation, there was vaccines and things were looking good, and it seemed like fall might look different than perhaps it looks with the Delta variant and some of the other changes that are happening during the pandemic. So from what we know, there's a good chance that our kids will be impacted by some kind of restrictions again. And we know that the Delta variant seems to be impacting our kids more directly. So perhaps what we know more than anything right now is that the pandemic remains uncertain and our kids are developing in the context of the ongoing uncertainty that COVID is bringing to all of our lives. So this can be a particularly bumpy ride for adolescents because of their developmental tasks that aren't exactly conducive to pandemic life. So for some of my very young patients, spending more time at home with caregivers was something that some kids actually enjoyed quite a bit. But with our adolescents, they're working to separate from their caregivers to some extent with support. They're learning to figure out who they are and to find their identity kind of on their own beyond the family system. And they're trying to do all of that while their world got smaller in certain ways because of COVID. Our adolescents are deeply social creatures who are currently cut off from their networks in some powerful ways. And they're looking to figure out who they are in this now smaller and yet also bigger because of the internet world. So we know a lot about resilience and trauma, and we know about the tasks of adolescence. So our job is to help our adolescents with those big tasks while dealing with the pandemic. So that takes me to the crux of what I want to emphasize, or if there's one point I want to make, it would be this. Parenting towards resilience means that we're neither minimizing the impact of the pandemic on our kids, nor are we catastrophizing the pandemic and giving our adolescents the message that they are being damaged beyond repair by this phase of their life. So here's what we know. COVID functions as a chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is an ongoing background kind of trauma that maybe gets worse, maybe gets better, but is kind of there. It's in the background. Poverty is a great example where a kid growing up in poverty might feel deeply loved and supported by their parents. But they have these kind of constant background concerns of, are we going to be okay? Are my needs going to be met? Will we have what we need? So at this point in the pandemic, we're kind of to that place where it's for our adolescents, it's this constant kind of background experience of uncertainty, anxiety, kind of the possibility of change. I think the other thing that the pandemic did for all of our children was made it apparent to them that the world can suddenly become disrupted in ways that we did not expect. So our adolescents are facing this through the specifics of adolescent development. So they're facing the same worries that everyone else has about the pandemic. Are they safe? Are their loved ones safe? How bad will it get? Will they be okay? Will it always be like this? Is there going to be a return to normal? And if so, what will that look like? Will it be something we've seen before, or how different will that new normal be? They wonder who's giving them accurate information. They have a lot of questions about, and a lot of thoughts at this age about the conflict and confusion and disagreements that adults have, and the tensions that adults are bringing to the table around the pandemic and what that means. But they're also missing the big rituals in their lives that mark the transition from childhood to adulthood. They've been missing their peers. They've been missing chances to be with friends and away from family and to kind of explore on their own. And they're missing experiences and opportunities to explore beyond the family system, or to kind of continue to be expanding their social world. So within that context, I think we can break down what our adolescents need from us and how we can best support them through this very odd time for us and very odd time for them. I mean, being an adolescent is already a pretty stressful thing, and an adolescent during the pandemic has its own difficulties. The first thing that our adolescents need from us during this time, and with this first one, I'll say they need this from us all the time, is they need to be heard. They need us to listen to them. The first place with any child, adolescents in particular, but a child of any age, is to be heard. They need us to listen to them. What does your adolescent say about what the pandemic is like for them? What is the hardest part for this adolescent? And what can you do to fill that gap and to be there to hear the pain of what cannot be filled? On the other hand, what does this adolescent like about pandemic life? That might sound strange, but I hear from adolescents, it is I cannot tolerate being away from my friends. I cannot tolerate being out of contact with my friends. But boy, has it been nice to not have to put up with certain bullying experiences, or I really haven't missed these things that I used to do. I actually feel a lot better not doing them. Okay. So what you're trying to do in listening is, yes, you fix what you can. If you have an answer and a solution to one of the things that's most painful and difficult for your adolescent, by all means, respond and fix that. But we also need to be just listening with respect and hearing our adolescents out on what the experience is like for them. And to remember that listening is in itself a powerful intervention. So when we listen to our children express distress to us, even when we don't have a practical solution, our capacity to sit with our children and listen to what they're trying to express to us is far more powerful than I think we sometimes recall. The second thing that our adolescents really need us to understand is that they need their social needs to be met. Adolescents need their friends. It's not just a preference, it's a developmental need during this time in their life. And of course, they also need to be kept safe. So during times of pandemic restrictions, this requires us to shift from some of what we might typically do. Before the pandemic, we probably had screen time limits. I, in fact, hope you had screen time limits before the pandemic. And I think we all know that our adolescents are on their screens far too much in general. But at the same time, when school goes remote, when sports get canceled, we need to be remembering that there is a developmental need for social contact, and we need to be thinking alongside and with our adolescents about how we are going to help them safely meet those needs. So that means that they need us to help them meet that need, both because it helps their development, but also because when we don't meet that need, we do run the risk of our kids going rogue and making decisions that might not be safe or might not be as safe as if we had worked with them to come up with solutions. So I recommend that you actively work with your adolescent to develop safe and appropriate ways of connecting with peers during various COVID restrictions. So that might look like it might be online, but it might be online in ways that you agree upon and are safe. So for example, I would much rather a kid be playing Fortnite with friends that they know in real life from school than chatting online with strangers or falling down various YouTube rabbit holes for hours on end. That might mean that you're allowing more FaceTime than you typically would, that you're changing your rules in the home about how much time is allowed on devices and in what categories. Along those lines with the social needs, and I'll kind of touch on this later, but if your child is doing school remotely or has not seen their friends in a long time and is just starting back with their friends in in-person school, if they're getting in trouble because they're on their device, I think you want to be considering what's going on with your kid about that. So instead of just moving to discipline, you might be asking, okay, my kid's getting in trouble because they're messaging friends, right? But are you considering what other times and appropriate avenues we've offered them to connect with their friends? The next category of what I believe our adolescents need right now from us is to be included in decision-making. That doesn't mean that you're going to put your adolescent in charge of what your family is going to do about the pandemic. But there are lots of reasons to be actively including your adolescent in decision-making about your family's response to the pandemic. You are helping them to learn to think through complicated, contradictory, and politicized information. You're helping them to think through and learn how to articulate their own values. You can also be working with them on how to evaluate a source, how to figure out what information is reliable and what information is not, and how to know that. And you can allow them to educate you on the same. These can be ongoing conversations in your family. But on top of that, if you are including your adolescent in conversations about your family's response to the pandemic and why you're doing what you're doing, you're going to have more buy-in from your teen than if you dictate to them. And we know this about adolescents, that when they feel talked down to or disrespected or like they're being dictated to, they tend to just not do it or say they're going to do it and not do it when we're not looking, that kind of stuff. But if they feel like they were a part of, or at least understand the reasons behind what's going on in their family system, they are far more likely to be compliant and to work with you and what you're trying to accomplish for the family. And this means allowing your kids to problem solve with you and kind of handing them some of these questions of, okay, I get it that you don't like masks, but I'm also worried because this Delta variant does seem to be getting more teens sick. What are your thoughts about that? And initiating open-ended conversations with your kids about this. Okay. The next category of what our teens and adolescents need right now is to be supported in their efforts to individuate. So if we do have to go to remote school again, if things do change again, how can you be helping your teen to be engaging in the world beyond the family system? And how can you help your teen help? How can you be supporting career exploration and other similar experiences within this context? How can you be giving independence? And how can you be helping your adolescent develop critical thinking? So just some examples I've seen. I've had Kids do a lot online in exploring potential career paths and also in taking steps in that direction. For example, I know kids who want to pursue a career as a tattoo artist who are able to get a bloodborne pathogen certificate online during the pandemic, things like that that are allowing them to interact with and learn more about paths that they might like to explore. Our adolescents need, and I think this is big and important, they need to be reassured that it's okay, that they are still on track for their future. Some of us adults worry about what this means for our kids. And of course we do. And of course, this is not ideal. I've said throughout the pandemic, if you can choose to do pretty much anything during a pandemic or not during a pandemic, always choose not during a pandemic. But the fact is, our kids are okay. There's nothing happening here in terms of missed opportunities from the pandemic that are going to be life altering. If we can get our kids safely, healthily through the pandemic, they're going to be okay. And they need us to have that kind of faith in them. An example that comes to my mind a lot, many of my patients are in foster care. And when they come into the system, they've been through a lot. Sometimes the system puts them through a lot as well. And they're academically behind, or they're socially behind, or they're struggling and not developmentally where we'd like them to be in certain ways. But what we inevitably find is that when we can help those kids feel safe, when we put them in nurturing family environments, they catch up. So this isn't ideal. It does have an impact, and yet they're going to be okay. And they need us to be believing in that for them. Our adolescents need to have their schooling issues met with grace. So what that means, we have asked our children to do things that we did not do during our schooling. We didn't have this mix of at-home learning, in-person learning, hybrid learning, and all of these rapid changes that also their teachers weren't prepared for. So if your child is falling behind, I would not start. It can be very tempting to come home to a kid who's been on video games for 8 hours and did none of their schoolwork and to just come down on them. But I encourage you to start by trying to figure out what's going on and trying to partner with your child to figure out what's going on with you in school. I would approach this with curiosity, not judgment. Normally your grades are pretty good. Right now you are missing a lot of assignments. Like, what do you think is going on? And how can I help you fix this? It's okay to insist, like, because we need to fix this. This is important and we have to figure this out. But at the same time, if we're not figuring out what's going on for our kids or what's going on that they're online on video games instead of doing their schoolwork, they might actually have gaps in skills or have something else going on with them that is a legitimate barrier that they need our help with. And we want our kids to be using those skills themselves, to be asking themselves, hey, what's working for me? What's not? What do I need? And learning how to talk to us about that. The other thing that our kids need right now is to be sensitive to the anxiety of when restrictions lift. Those changes are hard too. I know personally, about half my caseload went back to school this week. The other half goes back next week. I have been a busy woman dealing with kids really having a lot of anxiety alongside their excitement about returning to an in-person classroom. There's a lot of feelings that are coming up for kids. So what that means is as restrictions lift, you don't want to try to do everything at once. You don't want to make up for lost time. You want to start with what matters the most to your child. What has your child been missing the most that is the most crucial for them to have back? And you want to be starting there in terms of what you're reintroducing first. And you want to be talking to your adolescent about what this is like for them. Does it feel good or bad or both to be going back to school if that's the choice that your family made? And again, as a sidebar, I think the one thing that everyone needs to be doing for parents and for other parents, if you are a parent, this situation is not ideal, and no one should judge any parent for whatever decision they made about school this year. I just think as humans, we owe that to one another. Whatever you decided for your child for school this year, I absolutely believe you made the choice that you thought was best under a set of less than ideal circumstances. So I don't think anyone has space to judge any parents about what they chose here. But with our kids returning to school, for those who are, they need us to be supporting them with that. It's a lot of social interaction that they weren't used to. It's a lot of stimulation that they've had a break from. The final category before I shift topics is that when our kids are in quarantine, they need us to recognize that this can be a time of crisis for them. On the one hand, it sounds easy, like, hey, we're just asking you to stay home. But I've talked about how deeply social our teens are and how they do better when they're in connection. So when they're suddenly pulled and put in quarantine, that can be a time when some dark thoughts come up. That can be some times when, if your child is prone to or at risk for safety concerns, that is a time to be really mindful of what's going on with your teen, staying in close contact with them, helping them to figure out how they're going to structure their time in quarantine and how they're going to stay in touch with people who are important to them. And this is a time in my practice when I've seen the risk for self-injury or for suicidality to increase. I don't say that to worry you. I say that to think about it and to remember to be checking in with your adolescent in quarantine, remembering to be offering ways to safely, following quarantine protocols, to be in some kind of contact with the outside world, and to be, talking to your kids about how they're doing while they're in quarantine. So with that, I'm going to switch to the next topic of addressing self-harm in our adolescents. And really talking here about what you can be doing if your child comes to you talking about thoughts of or having had self-injured, or if you as a caregiver are starting to suspect that self-injury is something that's going on for your child. Okay, so if I sum up one point with this, it is whatever you're doing in response to your child's self-injury, you want to be maintaining your relationship with your kid. You want to be maintaining trust and connection, and in fact, if possible, building more. So we don't want our reactions that come from very human places of fear for our children to stop our kids from coming to us. If we're noticing signs of self-injury that kids aren't talking to us about, we want to be handling it in a way that forms a baseline of trust and makes it more likely that they are going to start to open up to us about it. So this means that we're working towards forming a bond where our kids can tell us when they need help to not hurt themselves. And we don't want to be doing anything that undermines that bond. It's important to remember that we cannot actually physically prevent our kids from self-harming completely. And we can sometimes harm our bond with our kids and our efforts to protect them. What I mean by that is, if you take all sharp objects away from your child will still have ways to self-harm if that is something that that child feels that they need to do. They can self-harm with their own bodies if that is something that they feel very intent on doing. So it can be helpful if your child says, look, it's the razor in the shower. It tempts me. When I'm in the shower, I feel like cutting. So in that situation, you might say, well, what if we got you an electric razor? What do you think? Right? But when a child feels like we're using control and surveillance to stop them from self-injuring, they tend to take it underground, and we're less likely to know what's going on. And we're less likely to be able to be in a kind of relationship that is offering help and support with this. It's vital to recognize that you don't know why your kid is self-harming unless they've talked to you about why they're self-harming, and that self-injury is not the same as suicidality. I'm not saying to assume that your child is not suicidal. Please do not assume that, and be having conversations and listening to your child. But it's very helpful to be saying to your child, like, what can you tell me about your cutting? Like, what does it mean to you? Like, help me understand. Because it doesn't mean the same thing for every child. This might, I hope that this sounds obvious, but these are things I've run into in my practice. Please do not laugh at their self-injury. Please don't minimize or exaggerate it. And I can talk about what that means. Don't tell kids that they just want attention. And I've even had kids who have had caregivers say, well, if you're going to hurt yourself, just kill yourself already. So you can see how all of those comments would absolutely shatter a bond with a kid. If a kid is crying out for attention, which in my clinical experience is typically not what's going on with self-harm at all, but if a kid is crying out for attention, what's so bad about that? If your kid needs attention, that's okay. We all do. So I want to go through just a few ideas about what we should do to when we are aware that our child is self-harming. The first is you should seek professional help. And I want you to do that because I'm talking about some generalities, but I hope I'm also emphasizing every situation is unique. And I want you, your child, and a professional thinking together and working together on this to develop interventions and solutions that are specific to your child and what's going on for your kid. It's important to invite your child to talk to you about their self-harm. Ask what you can do to help. Let them know that you love them, that you're concerned. You're not angry, but you are concerned, and that you want to support them as they find their way through this. If they need to stay with you to stay safe, you want them to do that. So you want to be saying, if you're feeling tempted to hurt yourself and there's something I can do to help you, let me know. If you just need to sit with me until the feeling passes, we can do that. You want them to know that they can come to you and that it's a good idea to come to you and that it's safe to come to you and that you can handle it if they come to you. That goes back to professional support too. I think parents very understandably have big feelings about this issue, and you might need your own place to be talking about what's coming up for you as you're supporting your child through this. I want you to be making use of professional support to assess for safety. It's not that no child who is self-harming needs to go inpatient. Some do to protect them. That happens, and it's important that when a child needs to be inpatient for safety, that happens. But at the same time, not all self-injury requires an inpatient stay. And sometimes self-harm is a symptom that can take some time to work through. And we don't want to put kids in residential treatment who do not need to be there. So it's important to be working with a professional to be balancing those concerns so that your child is safe, but that your child is in the least restrictive environment that works for your child's safety. We also need to be maintaining a relationship where kids can talk to us if they have self-harmed, and that they are able to show us what they've done, and that they don't feel, I don't want kids to get grounded because they cut. because what I want is if a kid has cut and then there's an issue with their cut and they need medical care, I want them to be telling us. We need to know that because we need to intervene for their safety at that point. Okay. If you are noticing self-injury and your kid is not opening up to you about it, it can be tempting to interrogate them, but it's not helpful. You can tell them that you've noticed the cuts, that you're not angry or upset with them, but that you are very worried and concerned, and that you want the child to know that they can talk to you about it. At that point, you're just trying to lay the foundation of saying, I'm here, I care, I want to know what's going on, I can handle hearing what's going on. And of course, just to emphasize it again, if you think your child is harming themselves and they're not talking to you about it, or if they are, that is absolutely an appropriate time to find some professional help for your child.